I did speak to a large device manufacturer earlier this year that told us they have $200 million of surgical field inventory that is unaccounted for. And I kind of, was taken aback, but then asked a little bit more. And he said that those items are on hospital shelves or even in rep trunks, where that ends up contributing to the cost of the implants that we end up putting in patients. Because you have to manage all of this inventory to ensure that you can sell your implants as well.
Beyond Clean offers a creative look into the inner workings of the healthcare industry committed to getting it right. Every instrument, every time. Join us every week as we explore the hidden world of one of the most important aspects of safe surgical care. And now your hosts, Hank Balch and Justin Poulin.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Keerthi Kanubaddi, founder and CEO at Ready Set Surgical. Ready Set simplifies the surgical vendor supply chain by consolidating logistics and communication to all members of the surgical team to ensure that every patient has the right equipment with the right sterilization parameters at the right time. I think we all know about patient rights, Hank, and I'm excited to get into this with Keerthi because I feel like this loaner management, or as we'll learn about, vendor managed inventory management, is a real hot topic these days, and certainly a need for this inventory that most hospitals do not own.
That's right, Justin. And it's one of the biggest challenges out there, not only for sterile processing leaders, but for OR leaders, surgeons, and the vendors themselves who are combating all kinds of logistical challenges.
Well, we've talked about that theme several times with previous guests, the need for data, but this is a process that is typically manual. So you want to talk about opportunity for improvement at your facility. If you don't have an electronic way of managing this loaner inventory, then you're going to enjoy today's show for certain. Just a reminder before we get into it, you can follow Beyond Clean on Twitter at Beyond Clean Info. The Facebook page is facebook.com/Beyond Clean Podcast. And the LinkedIn page, linkedin.com/company/Beyond Clean. If you have recommendations for future guests on the show, or you want to send us some feedback or even a question for a future show, just send the email to info@beyondclean.net. We'll be right back with Keerthi Kanubaddi, founder and CEO at Ready Set Surgical. Joining us now is Keerthi Kanubaddi, founder and CEO at Ready Set Surgical. Keerthi, why don't we do what we do every week with you and just have you introduce yourself to the listeners, give us a little bit of your background, and then we'll get into VMI, which I'll let you explain that acronym as well.
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me on the show. It really is nice to be able to join. I think you all have had really great content, so I'm appreciative of the opportunity. Just a little background about myself. I spent 12 years in the medical sales arena working for companies like J&J, Stryker, Cochlear Americas, and Karl Storz Endoscopy. And in that world, we dealt with VMI, as you mentioned, which is an acronym for Vendor Managed Inventory. I think it's used across a number of different fields. But in this particular area, it really speaks to the loaners and consignment inventory that hospitals usually borrow on a short-term or long-term basis from medical device companies. Now, working for all of these different companies, regardless of whichever one I went to, I saw these persistent problems in the vendor-managed surgical supply chain, whether it was late deliveries or missing instruments or maybe inadequate sterilization documentation. I personally witnessed quite a few instances where I thought the patient was negatively impacted by a poorly coordinated supply chain. And, that's always just bothersome to see that, to be a part of something like that. And as I began to dig deeper and meet people like Hank and people in the operating room and different facets of the hospital, I recognized that this problem is really systemic. It affects hospitals and device manufacturers equally.
Yeah, it really does. And I'm really happy to see how much it has taken off. You just know inventory management is one of the biggest challenges for sterile processing departments everywhere, let alone when they have control of it versus when they have less control over it. And I think that's a huge value prop for vendor managed inventory systems and solutions like yours. What do you think are some of the existing challenges for vendors as well, maybe benefits on both sides of the equation?
I'm glad you brought that up because, if you look at the research that's out there, GHX, some of these other large industry, entities have kind of been able to peg the amount of waste that is present in the vendor-managed surgical supply chain. It's estimated at $5 billion a year, and it's also estimated that it's split pretty equally between medical device companies and hospitals. So, in this world, it's really not uncommon for a rep to deliver hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of inventory for just a single procedure. And when you've got items like a screwdriver or a pedicle screw that can cost in excess of $1,000, the stakes are just really high. So it just makes sense that these device companies and reps really are under a constant pressure to manage this expensive field-based inventory. So we believe that increasing transparency in that supply chain is really the way that hospitals and device manufacturers can get rid of some of this inefficiency and the waste that exists. And we also think the best way to increase that transparency is really by collaboration. It's not an adversarial relationship, but rather you share procedural specifics between the OR, the surgeon, the vendor, the device manufacturer, and the central sterile department, and that should result in better planning for that patient procedure.
Keerthi, I had a technician, actually there were 4 technicians within a month who took jobs at a device manufacturer in my last facility, and one of them in particular became in charge of the logistics of these vendor trays that we're talking about today. And I was just talking to him actually last week and asking what that perspective change was from being the technician on the inside who's like, gosh, guys, why can't you get your trays here? Why is it at another hospital, when it should be here for our case? And giving the vendors a lot of grief. And then he took that position in charge of logistics. And he was telling me, Hank, you have no idea. It's way more complicated than we give those guys credit for. So could you talk, from your experience, what specifically those logistical challenges are on the ground floor?
Yeah, you bring up what I think is, probably a very likely scenario when people make the jump from the hospital to the industry side. You do recognize that, first of all, there is limited inventory. So that's one of the things that is really a driving force behind this. But I think more than anything else, it's this lack of transparency that exists out there. And when you don't have transparency about the demand signal for your inventory, especially at an aggregated kind of macro level that these device companies work at, you cannot be efficient with moving that inventory around. And then that results in people doing a bunch of overnight shipping. Potentially items are getting lost at one hospital, but it's being shipped to another hospital very quickly, and items can't be replenished or they're missed. So there are all these, costly kind of problems associated with the device side. And, not to get too deep into this, but I won't name the device manufacturer, but I did speak to a large device manufacturer earlier this year that told us they have $200 million of surgical field inventory that is unaccounted for. And I kind of, was taken aback, but then asked a little bit more. And he said that those items are on hospital shelves or even in rep trunks, where that ends up contributing to the cost of the implants that we end up putting in patients, because you have to manage all of this inventory to ensure that you can sell your implants as well.
Wow. Yeah. Well, you mentioned in your answer the phrase demand signal for inventory. Are you talking about case notifications there? So the manner in which these vendors say, your trays are needed tomorrow or in a week from now. I know that can happen in a number of ways, but because of that, it creates its own challenges.
Yep, and I think, Hank, you really have been on the front lines of this. You've seen this, especially in a department. But we definitely see this situation where a demand signal, it gets relayed to the vendor in a late fashion. We were actually implementing our technology at ReadySet at a hospital where it's a very well-known hospital where the reps were telling us they never receive more than 48 hours worth of notice. So the inevitable dominoes that fall after that are that they have to rush to get the inventory there. And sometimes, things can be missed in that rushed, just-in-time, case-specific inventory planning. So we really feel that, a rep is a part of the surgical team. They need to have the ability to receive a notification in a timely fashion to ensure that they can do right by that patient. And I can tell you, when I was a rep, I very rarely got early demand signals, but technology now allows for that. And, I'm proud to say that that's something that we focus on, is trying to let vendors know what the need is much earlier. And moving it upstream in that way really changes the dynamic, and we find it eliminates a lot of the problems that are typically associated with vendor delivery.
That is an enormous amount of inventory. And again, I understand why it's sort of unaccounted for. It is, but it's not. But I can only imagine, how difficult is it for them to, the reps today, let's say without a solution like yours, how hard is it for them to manage that inventory? What kind of data are they able to even collect on their own so that they know sort of where that's at and how to account for it?
I think really, in a way, the medical device companies have their own tools to manage inventory. The inherent issue with these tools are that they're siloed, and they don't have a way that you can tie it back to that specific episode of care in which that inventory was used. So that is really the missing component. They have tools for inventory management, but they really don't tie to the specific patient usage. And consequently, those items are not being tracked back to the patient record. So we really believe that there is a big gap when it comes to actionable intelligence that can come from the hospital that will help the vendor manage their inventory, and vice versa, to be able to let a hospital know, okay, we have to remove these consigned trays, and we're going to have some documentation and a paper trail around it. There are, in both ways, benefits if we're able to give information and receive more information in a transparent way.
So you mentioned, and actually Hank also outlined a scenario where somebody moved from a healthcare provider standpoint over to the vendor standpoint. I've done the same, and you also come from the vendor point and have worked in these hospitals supporting them as a vendor. You and I both know that vendor environment is extremely competitive, and everybody's always trying to get an edge. But I also wondered, I've heard some weird stories from different places, and I don't know if you've got some good ones or not, but maybe some of the games that vendors play with each other, as they're trying to position with a surgeon, or even as it just relates to inventory. I've heard of guys taking out key pieces of inventory when it's sitting on a non-locked rack just to mess with the competitor in the hospital. And I don't know if that's true or not, but do you have little key scenarios like that you've run into in your experience?
Well, I can say that I've never actually had a scenario where I had somebody purposely try to disrupt a patient procedure that my inventory was involved in. I've had some questionable situations where I thought something like that might happen, but I firmly believe that, you do see it all. There are good and bad reps, but I think most reps want to follow rules and do a good job for the patient, because that usually results in more business. So I think, there are competitive rep games, but once the reps really understand how integral they are to the entire workflow and to a good patient outcome, I think the good reps generally are ones that, will take extra effort and make sure that they do follow the rules. So I think I just like to go on record as saying I think most reps are trying to do a good job.
Yeah, I think that's true as well, but there's the difference between the accusation and the reality. And without data, it's really hard to clarify that when you have somebody who is making an accusation, hey, somebody's messing with my inventory. Can the importance of that aspect of, vendor managed inventory with the solution be understated?
I think you really are hitting on one of the key aspects. There is this, day-to-day impact of a vendor-managed inventory system where it can improve delivery times and compliance to hospital policies, whatever that, is set by the hospital. But the data really does serve as an important tool. When we deploy ReadySet in customers, we try to take baseline data about whether vendors are compliant to hospital policy. And unfortunately, not that surprisingly, they usually don't have data to back up what they believe is happening. Many times bad vendor behavior just receives a slap on the wrist and there's no tracking or documentation of that. So this is where I think the data really helps. If you understand what the service level of it is by vendor, by company, you can use this information to do a better job of contracting and choosing the best vendors and negotiating better pricing as well.
Does this also build trust between the hospital or the IDN and the vendors themselves? Just especially, as you know, sometimes when those bills come across and there's some question marks there, especially for missing inventory, et cetera. Does this help build trust between the two parties?
It does when people, especially the vendors, are following the protocol of the system, because the system kind of takes the guesswork out of it. And I would say any system that is in this space probably has similar characteristics where there is a proof of delivery and a documentation aspect that accompanies any one of these deliveries that are being brought into the hospital. And those are the ways that we protect hospitals from unsubstantiated loss claims. And also what it does is when people follow the protocol, it's very easy to point to the fact that you have followed protocol, and you can go back and say, this is the root cause of the problem. It wasn't necessarily because me as the rep delivered it late. We can go back and clearly see that these items were sitting and waiting for sterilization for 48 hours. Whatever the info might be, we believe that, there's kind of this aspect where they really, are going to get a little bit more information in general about this.
All right, we will be right back to talk more and take a deeper dive into SPD vendor managed inventory and how to manage it. We are back with Keerthi Kanubaddi, founder and CEO at ReadySet Surgical. Keerthi, let's talk about the current state of the union. Set the table for segment 2. In regards to sterile processing departments, vendor managed inventory, how they manage it, what's working or what's not working currently?
Well, as far as vendor managed inventory, I would say most sterile processing departments are dealing with it today in more of a paper and pencil fashion, and could be basically some manual work involved, a lack of awareness about what's coming, when it's coming. But those that are using vendor-managed inventory platforms are really kind of some of the early adopters. Vendor-managed inventory platforms are new to the market. They can be traced back to the introduction of some VMI-specific guidelines and recommendations from industry groups like ISHM, AMI, and AORN. And I'm sure most of the people on who would be listening to this call know who those groups are, but ISHM, for those that don't, is really the governing body for most of the central sterile professionals in the United States. AMI is a similar role for medical device manufacturers, and AORN is for operating room nurses. And all of these groups put out either a position statement or recommendation about how you should treat this inventory differently than the inventory that you own in the hospital. So, those were some of the things that were the overarching factors which have made platforms like this spring up. And incumbent technologies like instrument tracking systems really haven't had good penetration with their tools for loaner management, mostly because they treat loaners very similarly to how you would treat a hospital-owned inventory. In those systems, the hospital user is really the curator of the data, whereas a lot of these newer vendor-managed inventory systems and ReadySet, definitely, we turn that around and make the medical device representative and their organization be responsible for curating all of the data about their inventory, which makes sense because they know more about their inventory than anyone else would. And as we see hospitals starting to learn that you can remove work from your staff and not add this additional headache, we start to see the adoption growing there. So we think the current state is still paper and pencil, but we're seeing quite a few RFPs from the top hospital systems, and we think that the penetration in the market is relatively low now for systems like this.
That's right, Keerthi. I remember the first department that I worked in as a technician, and we were being onboarded and trained on the loaner tracking system that we had in place there. And it was a 3-sheet carbon copy that I thought was just fantastic. I mean, we had the rep's phone number. They had to outline all the trays they were delivering along with the sterilization instructions. I mean, it was golden, and we used that, for a couple of years until these technologies started popping up. And then I realized how much we didn't know that we needed to know and could have known, with this technology that can reach outside of those 4 hospital walls. But to the point about challenges, and I guess we can call them maybe roadblocks, what would you describe as some common roadblocks to sterile processing in terms of efficiency and compliance when you're talking about vendor-managed inventory?
I think there are actually quite a few roadblocks, but I think they're all stemming from one place, in my opinion. The biggest roadblock overall, I believe, to an efficient VMI, supply chain is lack of transparency. If you kind of look at the way that it's evolved in the current state, there's no single way for all surgical and sterilization team members and the vendors to stay on the same page about a procedure with the technology that's out there. And I think this lack of transparency manifests as late deliveries, incorrect equipment, missing documentation, late pickups, and can potentially cause patient harm. So if I had to say it was one thing, I think it's the transparency and then subsequently the accountability that would come along with that transparency.
So what about on the operating room side, say the surgeon or the nurse? Obviously, there's issues in sterile processing if you don't have all the information you need or if the trays are delivered late, but ultimately those issues are felt in the operating room in front of the surgeon, hopefully not with the patient on the table, but sometimes it is. What are some challenges there that vendor-managed inventory can solve?
Well, especially, tracking systems that do manage vendor-managed inventory, I think, will allow what is currently happening between the surgeon and rep to extend to the rest of the team. So if I look at whether a surgeon really recognizes or perceives problems with their vendor's inventory, I would say in many circumstances they do not. Usually the surgeon and the rep are 2 of the only people in the room who are on the same page about what was needed and what was brought in for that procedure. So when these vendor-related issues occur, surgeons might not even know that their favorite rep was to blame. So we found that the data out of our system can provide an objective measure of service level. And we've actually had, out of the data in ReadySet, our service level reports, we've had surgeons consider switching vendors because now they're looking at it independent of price. But is this person doing a good job? Is this vendor contributing to an efficient operating room and allowing me to start my cases on time? That right now, that relationship is almost untouchable, but data is the only way that we can introduce the objective measure that a surgeon needs to have when determining who they're going to use as a vendor.
So I think our listeners are probably like me. We've been talking about challenges here for a couple of minutes now and setting the backdrop for what's going on, why do we need technology and data to help solve some of these issues. But let's jump in. What are the current technological solutions that are getting to all these issues, the logistics, the case notifications, the transparency, as you mentioned, the communication and broadening that out from just the surgeon and the rep to the whole perioperative team. What are the answers to these problems?
Well, I will, I would love to tell you that, Ready Set is the only answer. I know that we answer many of these problems and actually all the ones that you mentioned, but there are a few VMI solutions on the market. And I think the central theme is that they create transparency and accountability. So anybody who's listening, I encourage them to do their own research about the product class. While we know that, the technology that exists and that we offer can issue this demand signal 7 days before a surgery and then allow the vendor through any smartphone or any computer to respond with the attributes of that inventory and also follow hospital policy when it comes to the delivery and removal of that inventory. We think that, anything that can improve your day-to-day management of vendor inventory is worth looking at. And those people who are really looking at these systems, I would just say there are a few things you should definitely consider. If the system claims that it doesn't house PHI, that's something I would be concerned with. I believe that, you have to be able to tie this inventory back to the patient record if you truly want to do what is the ideal state. I'd also make sure that any technology you invest in works or has the ability to communicate with existing hospital technologies. And I would say the final thing, as somebody who has really worked to build this technology or, a company that offers this technology, I don't believe, and we don't believe, that this technology should break the bank. Hospitals really should be able to acquire this technology because hospitals large and small and surgery centers have these problems. So it is our belief that we need to really focus first on making this technology accessible to people. And for that reason, Ready Set's within most hospitals' operational budget thresholds. And again, in my mind, the ideal state is when any hospital can fulfill their inventory needs for a given patient procedure well ahead of that procedure and ensure timely delivery, removal, proper sterilization, complete documentation, and compliance to the hospital policy. So I think if you can get those things in a system and you can find a provider, that's a good bet. And of course, we'd love to help any hospital that has those needs.
Keerthi, as a user on the inside of a hospital, I know something about these technologies that I absolutely love, in particular as a sterile processing leader, is it gives you that information, that forecast that you would not have any other way. Maybe by combing over a surgery schedule, you can see what vendors are going to be used for a procedure, if it's updated and if it's put in there, but the number of trays, the estimated time of delivery, obviously the catalog or the library of instructions for processing, having all of that stuff on the front end, that you're not in a rush at 12 o'clock at night with a courier who doesn't really know what trays he's dropping off and is not really sure what case they're supposed to go to. Having that streamlined, transparent, as you said, the opportunity even a week ahead of time to know and to staff accordingly, to ask questions on the front end if you need to. That kind of technology is just huge for sterile processing, its efficiency in terms of labor and also compliance, and just, are we processing these trays the way the manufacturer has said to? And the only way that we can know is if we have those IFUs that are tied to these trays. And can you do it via paper? Yes. Can you do it the way that it needs to be done on paper? Probably not. And we see the same thing that's happening in the OR in terms of their EMRs. They're, because they have to now by law, but they're transferring off of those paper charts onto electronic. But I just get with the times, because electronic makes you go through those specific choices, check the boxes. It keeps that data logged so you can go back and pull those reporting out of it. I mean, I'm so excited that this is on the market. It's such a huge need out there. And as you said, I hope our listeners will go, if they don't have one of these systems, go look, go see what's out there, see what's claiming to meet your needs, and, pull a couple of them in and see what they got.
I would definitely agree, and I think it's actually very gratifying to hear, somebody in your role say that, because quite frankly, that is the purpose, is to give that pre-delivery awareness, that ability to hold people accountable. But, a lot of hospitals will relate to us that our calendar view, which tabulates the amount of trays by day, week, or month, and the expected deliveries, allows them to just have a completely different approach to how they staff the department, what they do with the inventory. And as you said, the IFUs, we're flipping the script and making sure that those device manufacturers are telling you what the IFU is, and you're not looking in a third-party site for that information. Rather, it's already there right on the electronic back end of the label that you're looking at.
So one last question before we wrap this segment, but Keerthi, what I wanted to go into is a little bit further in that EMR sort of integration, personal health information you mentioned, that would be sort of integral to a solid system. Yours is HIPAA compliant, but it's also software as a service, which for some people, that's just to dumb it down a little bit, is a cloud-based solution, meaning it's hosted in the cloud and not just locally. What are some of the challenges there with integration? I'm sure you had to go through a lot of different steps, maybe HL7 compliance. That's not an easy thing for a company to go through in terms of a process, is it?
It's not easy, and it's actually very expensive. So I think that's also a consideration. Maybe some companies feel that the expense is too great to pursue that, but I can honestly say that having a platform that meets HIPAA requirements and being able to sign a business associate agreement with any hospital to ensure that data protection, again, is, to me, the real value of a system like this, where we are able to house just the case ID number, but because of that, we're able to tie it back to every other aspect of that patient intervention and episode of care. So yes, it was time-consuming, costly, but worth every penny.
All right, we will be back after just a short break to talk about the future of loaner management technologies. We're back with Keerthi Kanubaddi, founder and CEO at Ready Set Surgical. I know, Keerthi, you have some statistics you'd like to share with the listeners. I think it's a great way to kick off segment 3, really talking about interesting stats and data that will also drive the future of loaner management technologies. So why don't you share some of those with everybody listening today?
Great. I do like to share some of these stats because I find them to be astounding as well. But many people ask me, why don't hospitals just acquire the inventory that they need and, utilize some sort of additional third-party method to get the implants and replenishments necessary? Because it seems that this just-in-time, case-specific inventory delivery causes a lot of problems. But, the reason why these device companies do this and will put so much expense into it is, number one, they can usually recoup that cost in their implant prices, but the market is as large as you might expect. There were more than 10 million surgeries last year that utilized vendor-managed inventory, specifically loaner trays and consignment implants. Really, the value of that supply chain was around $55 billion. It's the largest single market in the world for medical devices and implants. If you look at how these device companies look at surgeon relationships, this is an interesting factor as well, and why they almost always put the surgeon relationship above everything else. The average surgeon relationship to a medical device company is valued at $50 million in lifetime value. The average cost of a loaner kit is $50,000. And it's estimated that there are 50,000 reps in acute procedural areas. So I don't know where all the 50 numbers come from, but they just happen to line up like that. But it is very interesting, I think, when you look at these dollars, you can see why so many haphazard things can go on, because really people are just trying to ensure that they get things to these surgeons for these procedures. But there is a better way, and I think that's kind of what we're talking about today.
$50 million. That's amazing. It reminds me on a very small scale, when I was a teenager, I worked at a local supermarket chain, and they trained us to always accept a return no matter what. Even if the case is empty and they bring you a box and say, I want my money back. And as a young teenager, I was thinking, that does not sound like a good policy. But then they threw out a stat like that said, yeah, but their commitment over time to this supermarket chain is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I'm thinking like, yep, that's not worth a carton of eggs. Right. Let's give them that return. That is, a huge number. Well, let's transition there a little bit into conversations about adoption rates for VMI technology at facilities. So we mentioned in the earlier segment at the folks who currently have this technology, the early adopters out there who kind of stepped out, not really knowing how it's going to work, what it's going to do, but now we've seen that it's successful in a host of ways. But can you talk a little bit about what percentage of hospitals out there would you say have something like this that they're using? And for the ones that don't, is it because they don't know about the technology? Is it because there's not money for it? What are some of the issues?
I think really, the technology is new, and the adoption at this point on a nationwide level is not high, and it's because this is really just getting on people's radar. Everyone knows that this is a problem, but there really haven't been solutions that are cost-effective, have a proven ROI, and also improve the workflow on both sides, really until now, we believe. So those are all contributing factors to the low adoption currently, but we also believe that a lot of hospitals just aren't aware of the technology and the fact that this is available as a standalone. And most hospitals have been indoctrinated with the instrument tracking systems, which can usually represent, a six-figure investment or more when you are all in. And it's just important to note that technologies like ours are usually quite a bit cheaper. I know for ReadySet, we are a fraction of the cost of traditional tracking systems because we take advantage of this cloud-based infrastructure and allow people to utilize our technology across sites without having this infrastructure requirement. So I think that, moving people along the buying cycle, understanding that the product is accessible. In the case of ReadySet, it's usually accessible less than the capital budget threshold, so within the operational budget of a given department.
So talking about operational budgets, I know we're coming up on our new fiscal year here in a couple of months, but if there's a department leader out there, operating room director, sterile processing director, maybe a VP of surgical services who are having some issues, shall we say, with vendors and their trays, what would some warning signs be that you would want to call their attention to say, you know what, your facility is probably in need of some of this kind of technology?
I really believe that the warning signs are maybe so prevalent that people won't pick them up as warning signs because the course of business has been paper and pencil till this point. So I would say any hospital that's using manual paper-driven processes to anticipate vendor inventory coming in, they really do need to consider a VMI platform. Secondarily, I think you start to look at large orthopedic facilities and facilities that focus on specialties that have quite a few vendors. So the first things that come to mind are orthopedics, neurosurgery, cardiac, ENT. So these are at least, there are many others, but these are the ones that seem to have a high volume. So if you specialize in those areas, might be another thing to consider. And in an area that we are moving into, if you have managed quite a few endoscopes and you don't have clear and capable tracking of your endoscopy, the sterilization cycles, the patient usage, those are areas that you might want to look at a technology like this because it allows you to utilize the base technology to track other items inexpensively.
Okay, that's great. Well, so say I'm convinced, I'm a sterile processing leader, and I say, I'm doing it by a paper and pencil, and it's not working. We're getting case delays. We're getting canceled procedures. We're getting trays that show up that we don't have on the schedule, and we're not getting trays that show up that we should. But I take these ideas and I'm going up the chain to my administrators, possibly the C-suite. What would be a roadmap that you would give leaders like me to overcome the objections that will come from the higher-ups?
First of all, that scenario that you just described is really a very common one. We do see that people in sterile processing departments are usually, this resonates with them because they recognize this problem, they're familiar with this problem, but they do need justification that speaks to the C-suite. And I think that's where the VMI companies like ReadySet can assist. You know, we have packets that will be specifically addressed to the different entities within the C-suite and also the different parts of the hospital management. We have also found the best approach and most effective approach is to have a cross-functional team review the VMI platform and look for the best overall value proposition. VMI systems like ReadySet have unique value propositions for the operating room, for supply chain, for sterile processing. So when you're able to get a committee of those individuals together, and also, finally, I would say you need to track data. You need to track the areas in which your department is being stressed if you want to make an adequate justification. Really, when you don't have data, you are just asking for something. And we've seen that supply chain is really gaining a lot of power in most healthcare organizations. So you really need to come with a true ROI and a justification. And, of course, you know, a company that is in this space, like ReadySet, should be able to provide that for you. But it also starts with tracking your own data.
You know, Keerthi, I'm still looking for that hospital out there that if you ask for something, they'll just give it to you. No business case needed, no value proposition. Just say, you know what, it would really be nice to have this. And they're like, well, here you go, sir.
What you need is a DeLorean, and you need to go back to the 1980s.
That's right.
You know, but you bring up the fact that that's not the real world. That's not the place that we live. We live in a place, as you said, the supply chain's getting very strong. They're wanting to see the ROI. They're wanting to see the numbers. How would you encourage leaders then to make that business case for a technology such as this?
I think the business case really has to be, you know, there are hard and soft dollars. And we've learned the lesson that soft improvements are great and they can help patient safety and they can help compliance. But those also, you need to have some hard dollars behind any justification as well. So you really have to start taking some measurements about the productivity, impact, how much time your staff is spending making calls for vendor inventory, how much time, how many instances you have to staff the department with PRN or overtime hours as a result of receiving unexpected inventory. Those types of things are the areas where there are real dollars, and it's important to really focus on those real dollars. And another area that we've seen is this instrument loss area. With a system like ReadySet, through the nature of the system, vendors have to take images of the trays they're delivering. And without those images, they're not able to claim lost instrumentation. So what ends up happening is it is a protective measure. So I would definitely look also at the instrument loss over the last year or so and really look and see if there was a validated proof of what was delivered before you paid that instrument loss claim.
All right, so let's talk about the future as we wrap up the interview. What's the next steps? Where are we going from here?
Well, we really believe the natural progression of a true vendor-managed inventory company that is going to put a circle around the entire process is to help validate pricing. So really against the item master. So what we believe is at this point, we understand what is coming in the hospital. We know the part numbers that are coming in. As you look at that inventory and ensure that it has a validated price and it's being PO is being generated and a replenishment is being sent in, that is going to be the ideal scenario where you're able to basically have a seamless supply chain between the device company and the hospital. And additionally, I think that these technologies will have other applications because they approach tracking in a very low-cost manner. So, as I mentioned before, the ability to track endoscopes and clinic inventory are just a few of the items that ReadySet will be offering, in addition to future capabilities around how you make sure that you're paying the right price for all of these bill-only items that the medical device vendor is bringing into the hospital. And I think that, when all of this shakes out, we'll see a much more organized supply chain and really a lot more well-stocked as well at any given hospital based on the expected need, as opposed to just buying at a supply chain level and not really understanding the specific use in each patient procedure.
It just occurred to me, you've done a lot of really good listening of your customer base. I mean, you really have the landscape down, the challenges in supply chain, how to lift them up, obviously flexible scopes. And just a couple of weeks ago, we had an excellent interview on that topic as well. But that's something that is a big concern to many hospitals. And so you're obviously tailoring your solution to the needs of the hospital and what they're talking about needing to be addressed.
Well, thank you so much for saying that and having me on the show. We really believe that technology like this should be driving down healthcare costs, and we really hope we're doing our part, but also to improve patient outcomes and surgical workflow. So it is a real pleasure to speak with both of you.
That was Keerthi Kanubaddi, everybody, founder and CEO at ReadySet Surgical. I'll tell you the one that sticks out for me, Hank, and I'm sure it's the same for you. $50 million.
Yeah, as you noticed, even in that interview, I was blown away. Not only the $50 million, but just the total scope of that industry in particular. Going back to the first segment, the fact that there are distributors out there who don't know where all of their inventory is, and to think that you can run a business that's worth that much money and still not have eyes and data on the location of all of your implants and tools, it really blew me away. So I learned a lot for sure in this interview.
Yeah, I really enjoyed his candidness about the future of it, and what the need is. I think the biggest thing is, another takeaway is, you asked a question, how do I get support to go to the C-level? If I'm trying to bring this technology, it's clearly a need. It has value for both the vendor and the healthcare institution, and it brings value to supply chain. At the same time, it's an expense, may not be as big of an expense as a full-blown, tracking system, but it's an expense. You've got to go ahead. Companies that put out this vendor managed inventory solution have to be able to support their customers with some sort of statistics, some sort of justification. And I think we all know the companies that provide that kind of evidence-based data or analytics are the ones that help their customers get the types of products and services into the hospital that they need.
That's right, because as a sterile processing leader or even operating room leader, we only know what we know. We don't know what we don't know. And these companies are in multiple hospitals across the country who make these arguments day in, day out at big meetings all the way up to the C-suite. They've heard way more objections than we have, and they have that, again, the data to say, how are these responding? What ideas overcome those objections most commonly? But in particular, obviously, to know the specific hospital, the specific context. Are the administrators in a cost savings mode? Are they in safety compliance mode? Depending on what that is, obviously, will mean the tool set that you bring to the table. But to your point, that's hugely important for the vendors to support those folks as they make those up the chain arguments. Something that stood out to me was the quote where he mentioned oftentimes in the OR room, the only two folks who know what are going on with that vendor inventory is the surgeon and the rep. And That is so true. And I've seen it happen on so many occasions where there are issues or there's a last minute change. And those two folks know what's going on. And sterile processing, our room nurses, we're scrambling to try to fill in the gaps. But this kind of technology can solve that on the front end.
Yeah, definitely a need. And the other thing he said too was a lot about the power that supply chain has gained in the industry. And I know we talked to Allison Sonstely in one of our very first episodes about her move from sterile processing over to a role in supply chain, and her department had won Supply Chain of the Year, which was one of the big had won Sterile Processing Department of the Year, which was a big point of conversation there. But one thing that he illuminates is something along the lines of the move towards value-based purchasing. That's why that data and analytics is so important. And to your point, if nobody knows what's going on, especially the people who are managing that $50 million value that each individual surgeon has, or I think the billions of dollars in inventory that's sitting on the shelves, they are going to want to know and this is a big movement in ARM, which is the issue for supply chain, cost, quality, and outcomes. And I would think that there's data to show that managing this inventory properly, not having last minute cases and rushing things in, would help improve outcomes just based on preparation.
Well, that's right. And as you mentioned, without that value proposition, you're just asking. And as we talked about, I still have not found the place where just asking gets you what you want. So I'm excited to send out this content to our listeners. Hopefully folks will be able to walk away from this show and have some more tools, some more idea and exposures to fixing these systemic vendor problems that are facing their facilities every day.
That's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on iTunes and Stitcher. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to Hank and myself. Thank you for listening to another edition of Beyond Clean.